In this part 3 of Unit 3, we're going to take a closer examination of the stomach, the function of the small intestine, and the role that the accessory digestive organs play in the digestion and absorption of nutrients. So on this slide, we see, picking up from part 2 of Unit 3, we see in this upper illustration in the upper left-hand corner a bolus of food entering the stomach, and as we discussed previously, and we'll take a closer look at this here in this unit, the stomach is composed of smooth muscle, and when it contracts, it churns the food churns that bolus of food, thereby contributing to the mechanical digestion of food. And we'll discuss the other items on this box on the right-hand side on this slide and the later slides. And so we see not just mechanical digestion, but we also see chemical digestion, primarily of proteins. So when you think about the three macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, protein digestion from a chemical perspective begins in the stomach, and that's where the bolus of food gets converted into chyme. The interior of the stomach is composed of what is referred to as rugae, and these are folds in the stomach lining. And we see throughout the digestive system that the tissue is folded numerous times in order to increase the surface area of the digestive system. The cardiac region is named accordingly because it is relatively close to the heart, and that reflects the opening of the esophagus into the stomach. Here we see a more detailed anatomical outline of the stomach. And so we begin with entry into the stomach from the esophagus, and we see this large dome-shaped proximal portion of the stomach that is just simply referred to as the fundus and is often used as a landmark during certain surgical procedures. The stomach itself is made up of three separate smooth muscle layers, referred to, as we discussed in an earlier unit, the muscularis externa. In this particular case with the stomach, there's a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. And the advantage of having these three layers of smooth muscle with fibers at different angles to each other is it will create a non-symmetrical distortion of the stomach, thereby increasing the mechanical digestion of the bolus of food. The pylorus refers to the opening of the distal part of the stomach into the first part of the small intestine, referred to as the duodenum or duodenum. Both pronunciations are correct. The emptying of the stomach is regulated by the pyloric sphincter, which is also referred to as a valve, and is basically a thickening of the muscularis externa layer at this region, so that when it contracts, it will pinch down, close up the opening, and prevent stomach emptying. The advantage is that it keeps the food, or what was referred to earlier as a bolus of food, in the stomach, thereby increasing the time for mechanical and chemical digestion. The pyloric canal is the immediate proximal opening through the pylorus, and the pyloric antrum is a term referring to just the general narrowing of the distal portion of the stomach as it approaches the pyloric canal. If we take a closer look at the cross-sectional area of the tissue of the stomach, I'm only going to highlight a few things on this slide here. So we'll make quick reference to the left-hand side. As was discussed earlier, we have the various layers of the stomach wall. Of course, the muscularis externa, which was just discussed on the previous slide, made up of three different layers of smooth muscle. But what we see here in the wall of the stomach are what are referred to as gastric pits. And the gastric pits are invaginations of the stomach wall that are lined with cells. And these are the cells that produces the components of what is referred to as gastric juice. So the gastric juice is made up of mucus and very important secretions from parietal cells, and these parietal cells will produce a compound referred to as hydrochloric acid. And the hydrochloric acid serves two functions. It decreases the pH of the stomach, makes it very acidic, and that acidity will accelerate the chemical digestion of proteins. But we also see these chief cells that line the gastric pits that produces a protein called pepsinogen. In the presence of hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen gets converted into its active form called pepsin, which will also accelerate the chemical digestion of protein in the food that we consumed. So the key point to take from this slide are the two types of cells within the gastric pits that produces compounds that will accelerate the chemical digestion of proteins. So just to review, the gastric pits produces gastric juice, which includes a mucus, and the mucus has a high pH characteristic, and that high pH, as a result of the bicarbonate that's part of the mucus, will help to offset the highly acidic nature of the other secretions. So the alkaline mucus does serve a protective role. The control of the stomach comes by way of the parasympathetic nervous system through cranial nerve 10, or just simply the vagus nerve. And when the parasympathetic nervous system is active, it has the effect of increasing gastric gland secretion. And this is part of the nervous system that's active after a meal. There are local reflexes, and the local reflexes are triggered by the physical presence of a bolus. So the physical presence of food that we've consumed increases the stretch on the stomach wall, and that simple stretch will in turn increase activity of the gastric pits. There are other stimuli. So when I say head, psychological stimuli, the sight, smell, and sound of food cooking will activate the vagus nerve and begin the process of gastric secretion before we've actually consumed any food. As I mentioned, the presence of food in the stomach will also trigger gastric gland secretion, and the presence of chyme in the small intestine will also further contribute to gastric gland secretion. Moving on to the small intestine. The small intestine is the body's major absorptive organ. So here we see the vast majority of digestion take place, but we also see the second important function of the digestive system, that being absorption. The small intestine extends from the pyloric sphincter to the ileocecal valve, which is at the junction of the large intestine, and is composed of three separate divisions. The shortest division, the most proximal, is the duodenum, followed thereby the jejunum, and finally the third and most distal component of the small intestine is the ileum. The duodenum, as I mentioned, is the shortest component. In the adult, it's approximately 10 inches long and contains a tube referred to as an ampulla, which is a connection from the bile duct, which carries bile from the liver, and the pancreatic duct in the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And this is where we have the connection from the accessory digestive organs into the small intestine. The jejunum, the next part, is fairly long. There are estimates average about 8 feet in the average adult, and the jejunum extends to the ileum, which is also a very long component of the small intestine at approximately 12 feet long. And the ileum joins the large intestine at the ileocecal valve, But we also see the small intestine nerve supply that receives branches from both sympathetic and the parasympathetic components of the autonomic nervous system. And these extend from the thoracic splanchnic nerves. The arterial supply to the small intestine arises from the superior mesenteric artery, and venous blood drains into the mesenteric vein. And then from the mesenteric vein travels or fuses into the hepatic portal vein, and the hepatic portal vein carries nutrients into the liver. So once blood leaves the small intestine, before it goes back into the general circulation, it makes a first pass through the liver where various nutrients are removed, stored, used by the liver, and that blood will continue on into the hepatic vein and into the general circulation. So this is an illustration that I think nicely summarizes the small intestine from the stomach into the duodenum, the longer jejunum, and the very long ileum, where it eventually moves into the large intestine. And the small intestine is a very critical component of the digestive system, because not only is it the site of nutrient absorption, but is also a very important site for chemical digestion and interaction with the accessory digestive organs. And we'll discuss these shortly, but this table or this box here on the right hand side nicely summarizes the contributions from the accessory digestive organs into the small intestine. In terms of absorption, there are three cellular mechanisms by which nutrients move from the outside of the intestinal cell. And so when we say the outside of the intestinal cell, we are here in the lumen of the small intestine. And so nutrients have been mechanically and chemically digested, and we use simple diffusion in which nutrients will just move through the walls of the intestinal cells. We use facilitated diffusion, in which proteins embedded in the wall of the cells will chemically bind nutrients and move those nutrients into the cell. And we use active transport mechanisms, where the cells of the small intestine will actually consume energy and engage in metabolism in order to absorb certain nutrients. So in terms of simple diffusion, H2O, water molecules, will absorb quite easily through the small intestine and into the cardiovascular system. Lipids also move lipid molecules will also move via simple diffusion, eventually through the intestinal cells. But lipids will eventually move directly into the lymphatic system, not directly into the cardiovascular system. It makes a pass through the lymphatic system first, and we'll discuss that later. Fat-soluble vitamins will also use simple diffusion and will be absorbed along with other lipid molecules. In terms of facilitated diffusion, fructose, which is one type of monosaccharide, will bind to a protein receptor and will move into the cell. Water-soluble vitamins will get absorbed by binding to certain proteins embedded in the membrane of the intestinal cell as well. Glucose and galactose absorption will require the use of a protein receptor as well, but will also require the intestinal cell to expend metabolic energy in order to move glucose, galactose, and amino acids into the intestinal cell and eventually move into the cardiovascular system. So I'm only going to spend a moment here on this slide. This illustration is a simple representation of the cardiovascular system, and I'd like to focus on this bottom part here, where we see red blood, oxygenated blood moving into the digestive system, and then we see that blood will make a pass through the liver first, through the hepatic portal vein, and eventually into the hepatic vein and into the general circulation. So in terms of the accessory organs, what we have here, the accessory organs will produce compounds and generate secretions that will contribute to chemical digestion, and those compounds are moved directly into the proximal portion of the small intestine, and it does so through a system of ducts. And although it's not pictured on this diagram, the liver will produce compounds that will move eventually into the small intestine through the right and left hepatic ducts. The common hepatic duct is a tube that results from fusion of the right and left hepatic ducts into just one common tube coming from the liver. The bile duct and sphincter is fusion of the cystic duct, which takes secretions, bile, from the stored in the gallbladder and fuses with the common hepatic duct into what's called the bile duct. But the secretions are controlled by a ring of smooth muscle referred to as a sphincter. And so that smooth muscle will control those secretions into the small intestine. The pancreas is a very important accessory digestive organ in that it produces enzymes that will move directly into the small intestine through the main pancreatic duct and the sphincter. So the liver is the largest gland in the body. It's composed of 4 primary lobes, and it's anchored to the lesser curvature of the stomach by that broad sheet of connective tissue referred to as the omentum. The blood vessels associated with the liver is the hepatic artery. Oxygenated blood comes into the liver via the hepatic artery, and the hepatic portal vein is blood coming into the liver from the digestive system. In terms of the chemical digestion function of the liver, is that the liver will produce bile. It will travel through the common hepatic duct, and it will fuse with the cystic duct from the gallbladder to form the bile duct, but that bile is also stored in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder itself does not produce the bile. The liver produces bile, but it will be stored for later use in the gallbladder. And so bile is an alkaline solution. It's an opposite to an acidic solution, and it also is composed of bile salts and phospholipids. And these components will aid in the chemical digestion of food. The bile salts are important for something called fat emulsification, and larger lipid molecules have to be broken down, chemically digested in order to be absorbed. The bile salts contributes to that breakup of larger lipid molecules into smaller lipid molecules. And so the separation of those fat molecules is important if we want to be able to absorb those nutrients and use them for physiological purposes. Upon completion, bile salts are recycled back to the liver and are used once again to make more bile. Bilirubin is a bile pigment and is actually a waste product of associated with red blood cell breakdown. So we're constantly making new red blood cells to replace the ones that eventually break down, and the heme component provides that pigment to bilirubin. And eventually these are absorbed from the blood by liver cells. The gallbladder, it's a small sac, as you saw on the previous diagram. It's located under the liver, and as indicated earlier, it stores the bile that was produced by the liver. The gallbladder essentially is a wall of smooth muscle, and when that smooth muscle is triggered to contract, it will push the bile out into the cystic duct and eventually will move into the small intestine. And that bile will contribute to chemical digestion. Cholecystokinin is a hormone. This is a hormone that is produced by the cells in the small intestine, the intestinal cells, when lipids enter that proximal part of the small intestine, the duodenum. So fatty chyme is a trigger for intestinal cells to produce cholecystokinin, and cholecystokinin is a very strong and potent stimulus for the smooth muscle of the gallbladder to contract. So the signal to the gallbladder comes by way of what we eat. And so when we consume lipids, the lipids are detected by the small intestinal cells. The small intestinal cells will then generate a signal to the gallbladder that there is fat in the small intestine that needs chemical digesting. Some people produce what are called gallstones. And so gallstones are essentially small crystallized deposits of cholesterol, mucus, calcium, and protein. And these gallstones do present problems and generates a great deal of pain and discomfort to people that suffer from them, because those crystals can get large enough where it can block the opening of the gallbladder. So there are some factors that are statistically related to predisposition to gallstone formation. Women seem to be more prone to gallstone formation than men. Older individuals, a high-fat diet, obesity, and diabetes are all factors that are statistically related to gallstone development in that gland. The pancreas is encircled, a very important accessory digestive organ, and it's encircled by the duodenum, and it produces enzymes, which are proteins that breaks down food and delivers to the duodenum. So the pancreas produces these enzymes through an exocrine process, and so the enzymes are delivered directly into the duodenum. It doesn't go through the cardiovascular system, and it's delivered through the main pancreatic duct in what's called pancreatic juice. So the main pancreatic duct fuses with the bile duct, and the pancreatic juice is composed of water, these very important digestive enzymes, as well as electrolytes, which are charged elements. It has a high pH, so it's very alkaline, opposite to acidic, and this helps to neutralize acidic chyme. Chyme is acidic because when the stomach empties, it doesn't just empty the broken down food bolus, it also empties the hydrochloric acid and the gastric juice that is very acidic. We'll discuss the role of the pancreas in a later lecture, but the pancreas also serves a very important endocrine process in that it produces two proteins, insulin and glucagon, which function as hormones. And these hormones are involved in the regulation of blood glucose in the body. And so this ends our part 3 of Unit 3, and we'll continue with part 4 of Unit 3, where we'll continue our discussion of the structure and function of the large intestine.